In this session, we're going to turn our attention as a point of focus. We're not going to forget the parts of thinking, and we'll still be using them in the questioning process. We're going to put special emphasis on standards for thinking, intellectual standards for thinking. Now, the point was made that critical thinking depends on learning what is universal in thinking. The power of the elements of thought as a means of questioning and thinking about thinking is precisely that these parts are universal. If you could only use them once in a while, they wouldn't be nearly as powerful. Well, just as there are universal parts of thinking which you can learn and bring into your thinking as you think about your thinking and improve your thinking because you know these parts, so there are universal standards for thinking. There are universal attributes of thinking which are desirable and universal attributes of thinking that are undesirable. Undesirable not because I said so, but because they defeat the very purpose of thinking itself. They are something intrinsic, if you will, to the logic of thinking and what thinking is trying to do as thinking. For example, thinking is trying to communicate. Thinking is trying to learn. Thinking is trying to explain. And if it is unclear, it doesn't communicate. It doesn't explain. It doesn't learn. So if I say, I've unclearly learned mathematics, that's another way of saying I haven't learned it, or I've unclearly explained it to the students. Then the explanation hasn't succeeded. When the mind is unclear, when it is confused, when it is fuzzy, when it is vague, when it is muddled, then it is not clear. And no one would say with pride, my thinking is fuzzy, vague, muddled, confused, and unclear. So these are attributes of thinking that needs help. They're a failure of thinking to achieve something that thinking is about, clarity. If our students learn simply to think clearly, tremendous benefit would come to them. They would say what they mean and mean what they say. Their directions would mislead no one. Their commitments would be real. Much good would come from clear thinking. Politicians could not get elected saying what they're saying today because we would recognize that most of what they're saying is not clear, is not saying anything, is just words not carefully connected with meaning. So clarity of thought is an important attribute of thought. It's universally desirable. Now, there is a second standard of thinking that we're concerned with, and that standard is precision, very closely connected to clarity. Clarity says that what we've said is understandable. Precision brings detail and specificity to that clarity. So if I say, would you like to get something to eat? And you say yes. Your yes makes clear you would like to get something to eat. But still you haven't specified yet what you want. So you can say something that is clear, yes, I would like to get something to eat, but there may be a further specification we need that will make your yes more precise. So precision of thought occurs when we take something which is clear and specified and add detail. So by the way, each of these concerns translates into questions. Let me step back for a moment and deal with clarity at the level of the questions that you can ask to achieve it. And you want students to learn to question their thinking using these standards because the questions that call for clarity help you to achieve clarity. And there are three questions at least that you can ask in the act of clarification. There are actually many more than three, but these are three basic ones. We should ask them, and we should teach our students to ask them. Here's the first question. Could you elaborate further on what you have said? Could you express the details in perhaps other words? This is a call for elaboration. Elaboration can clarify. I spell it out more. Second question of clarification, could you illustrate that? Could you give me an illustration? Could you draw a picture, give me a metaphor, give me an analogy, give me something that illustrates or models what you're saying? And that's the second point of clarification, a way to achieve greater clarity. Here is the third, and probably of all the most powerful. Could you give me an example of what you mean? Because now the thought is connected with real life. It is translated into something concrete and real that we can all observe and touch and feel and smell. And life is concrete. Life is not abstract. You don't live life abstractly, you live a life, very concrete. You do something specific on Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday. And when I ask my students for examples, they very often say something abstract. I find that my students are poor at giving examples. And I find it interesting that many people say they're concrete thinkers. But I find they're abstract thinkers that keep talking abstractly. And to give a concrete example is something they know little about. To be specific and detailed and concrete. Give me a for instance. Describe a particular person in a particular situation in a particular context. They're very weak at that. So I don't think students are concrete thinkers. I think they're very abstract thinkers, and they need to become far more concrete than they are. One of the things which I loved about Jerry Nozich's talk and Linda Elder's talk is that we're filled with examples, because it's examples that give power to thinking and that clarify. So, 3 questions. Could you elaborate further? Could you give me an illustration? Could you give me an example? That's clarification. Now, let's look at questions regarding precision. It's really a simple, precision is a simple thing. It's adding detail and specificity. So it goes beyond simple clarity to give detail. And detail is sometimes very important. And so the temperature of the patient is hot. The patient is hot. Okay, that's clear enough, and it's a rough thing, but what exactly is the temperature of the patient? Could you give me the details? Now, context determines the degree of precision that is relevant. For example, with something like temperature, we want it to tenths of a degree, 98.4. 100.1. We don't need it to a hundredth of a degree, we don't need it to a thousandth of a degree, and we certainly don't need it to the 10,000ths of a degree. However, if it is a question of lead in the drinking water, we want it in parts per million. So we want much greater specificity for that than this. And so we have to know that precision is a contextual matter and help students to discover this and help them to give the detail and specificity which is relevant to the context. So clarity and precision.
The third session, which would have been, what, 1, 2, 3 sessions ago, we looked at critical thinking part 1, working alone. And what we did at that time, we were introduced to the model critical thinking developed by Richard Paul. And what his model did, it said that with all thinking, with all thought, there are parts to that thinking, parts to that thought. So if we want to analyze thought, if we want to improve our thought, it's important to identify those parts. Then what he did is he also came up with a set of standards that we can use for evaluating each of those parts. And so we looked at some of those standards. So together, the elements and standards are really what makes up his model of critical thinking. And so we talked about how if we were mindful in applying this model, we could really do even better critical thinking with this model. So that's kind of what we did, the gist of what we did on the critical thinking part 1, working alone. Last week, when we looked at critical thinking part 2, working together, we saw a video by Shauna Shapiro. And she, along with some of her colleagues in 2006, published a paper in which they identified the mechanics of mindfulness. Now, this was hardly new, but what was new about it was that they identified it and began to research it from a scientific perspective. And you recall that the three parts of any meditation are intention, attention, and attitude. And one of the things that she emphasized is not only is it important to be aware of what our intention is and be aware and know what we're paying attention to, but to be aware of our attitude and to also be careful about what kind of attitude we brought to any particular situation, where it's meditation or the business at hand. And so what we did, and it's represented on this handout, what we did is we combined the notions of intention, attitude, and intention, attitude, and awareness. What did I forget? Thank you. And with the idea of CAPS, and those were the standards, 4 of the standards of critical thinking: clarity, accuracy, precision, and significance. And the idea was that if I were clear in my intention, if I knew what I was going to pay attention to, if I was aware of my attitude and what attitude I was bringing to the situation, I had done everything I could in my own part to be the best me in this particular situation. So now I'm bringing the best me to this particular situation. What can I do collaboratively with these other people to make sure that we're going to get the best possible outcome? And the suggestion is if we apply those 4 standards, and I gave you a series of questions we could ask that might help us to do that, then we'd likely to have a better outcome. So we're kind of all building on that. That's where we're headed today. And so this video is a video of Richard Paul himself talking about these standards. Not significance, but he does talk about clarity, accuracy, and precision. And what this does, it really sets up where we're heading with this whole idea of whole messages, and how this mindfulness that we're doing and how this application of these standards, you know, really just naturally feeds into what we would call a whole complete message, which leads to the kind of things that we want: clarity, accuracy, precision, and so forth. So let's see if that all kind of makes sense as we continue to move forward. So we'll do this video of Richard Paul. Sitting in a comfortable upright position, back straight, neck long, chin slightly down, feet flat on the floor, shoulders relaxed, back, arms falling from the shoulders gently along the side, hands on the thighs or cup between the legs or perhaps on the table in front of us. Settling in, arriving, taking this opportunity to be present, to be here for ourselves. So bringing the attention to the breath, the in-breath and the out-breath. Breathing in and breathing out. Just allowing the breath to breathe. Through no effort of our own, we breathe. Steady, easy, rhythmic, the breath. Coming in and going out. So bringing the attention to the area of the nose and the nostrils, not ignoring anything else that might come into our awareness, but simply choosing to pay attention to the breath, bringing the attention to the nose. Noticing how on the in-breath, the air seems cool. And on the out-breath, the air seems warm. Cool coming in and warm going out. the felt experience of the breath, in and out. Steady, easy, natural. You may have noticed that on the in-breath, just before the out-breath, there's a pause, a gap, a moment of stillness. Noticing that stillness between the breath. And on the out-breath, just before the in-breath, there's a pause, a gap, a moment of stillness. Noticing the stillness between the breaths. Breathing in and breathing out. Bringing the attention to that place where the breath is most vivid, most alive. For some of us, it's in the area of the face, the nose, the nostrils. Others of us, it may be in the trunk, the upper body. Noticing how the chest fills and empties with the in-breath and out-breath. Or how the stomach and abdomen expand and contract with the in-breath and out-breath. Perhaps feeling how the entire torso fills and empties, front, back, the sides, with the in-breath and the out-breath. So noticing that place for us where the breath is most alive, most vivid. Settling into that breath, that place. Steady, easy, still. Breathing in and breathing out. Not ignoring anything that comes into our awareness, whether it's sounds or sensations of the body or thoughts or feelings, but simply paying attention to the breath. Fully present, fully now. Okay, any thoughts on the meditation, the video? This is your time. I have an agenda and we will get through it.
I found it interesting in the video when he said that, and I know this wasn't the point of the video, but when he was talking about students being more abstract thinkers than concrete thinkers, that struck me because it's the opposite of what I would have thought. It seems like a lot of people can memorize facts, but understanding theories and concepts is more difficult. But he seems to be saying
Yeah.
On that point, in the class I teach in international marketing, we talk about cultures as being more prone to concrete thinking and others more abstractions. And in the College of Business, I do have to encourage them to think abstractly, especially when it comes to imagining what, say, their target audience's motivations might be, their values. An abstract thought could be something like, what is it? Independence, is an abstract thought. I mean, how do you picture independence? It doesn't look like, if I say cat, you know what I mean, but independence, democracy, love, what does that look like?
Yeah, notice that Richard Paul, when he's talking about clarity, he talks about some questions we ask in order to get clarity. And when you look at all of the recommendations that he makes, the questions you would ask in order to get clarity, there's actually 6 of them. And as I was reviewing his material and getting ready to do this today, I came across another video, a TED Talk, in which a fellow was talking about learning. And he said you have to learn something 6 different ways in order to really get it. And I thought, well, wait a minute. Richard Paul has 6 questions that you ask to get clarity. And I realize there's a correspondence here. There may not be equivalent, but I can walk you through it very quickly. So in my class, for example, if a student has to give me, if I'm going to follow us all the way through to the end, the student would give me their initial answer to something. Okay, we can call that the definition or the statement. And then I would have them elaborate on that. Say it another way, put it in their own words, in effect paraphrasing their own work. And then I would ask them to provide a concrete example. And not an example out of the book, but an example from their own experience or something that they had perceived. And not a description of the event, but an actual event, an instance of. And I have found that is incredibly challenging for them. And I don't think it's because they're not concrete thinkers. They have a lot of difficulty taking the abstract and bringing it to the concrete. And so this is the great challenge in education, as I see it, is taking the abstract and making it concrete and then working your way back up through that abstraction from that concrete basis. And that is what experiential education essentially is. And that's one of the reasons I think Ferris is so great, is that you have an experience of something, okay, which really informs all of these abstractions you have, and so there's a kind of learning that can take place that just otherwise wouldn't take place. But okay, so you have statement, you have elaboration, you have example, then the 4th one is illustration. So that could be a diagram, that could be a picture, some kind of visual representation, it could be use of analogies or metaphors, because that's creative kinds of spatial thinking. So now we have 4. But there's also a 5th thing that we can do. We can actually give a person the experience of it. This is what experiential education is, right? But experiential education doesn't occur just experience. It's all of these other things that are weaved in as part of that experience. And then the 6th thing, and this is significant, is have that person teach another person. There's a whole kind of different thinking that you have to go through when you now have the responsibility of teaching this to another person. It's one thing to be the receiver-interactor, but there's a whole kind of other processing that goes involved. So if you can get someone to do all 6 of those things reasonably well, then there's going to be some real learning going on. And so those are the 6 suggestions that Paul makes for clarity. Okay, so clarity's a big deal. So in his own way, he's kind of saying the same way that this guy says, you got to learn it in 6 different ways. So let's see, any other thoughts on that? So what we're doing here today is we're taking the work that we've done the last couple of weeks and we're combining it with an interpersonal communication we call a whole message. And the idea of the whole message is I'm giving you everything I know about me that is involved in this situation. I am telling you what the event is. I'm describing it. I'm giving facts. I'm avoiding inferences. Okay? I can save those for later. So this is my description. This is what's in front of us. This is what the problem is. And so I describe that. Okay? And then secondly, what I do, and this is optional, I put optional, but I would do this if it was okay with the person, is I would describe what's going on in my body. I would say, I notice that there's this kind of this irritability, agitation here in my chest, and I think about it, my hands are shaking a little bit, or I might say I feel really warm. Okay, that's an optional thing. But again, this is pertinent information. This is information about me that clearly impacts my performance in the moment. So at the very least, I want to have that self-awareness. Remember, intention, attention, attitude. Okay, so I'm starting with that. The second thing, or third thing that you will include is, these are my thoughts. This is what I think about this event. Okay, and that might include, these are my perceptions of the event. Okay, and of course, central to all of this, and many of you are familiar with this, is the ownership. This is my description, my understanding. These are my thoughts. Okay, my perceptions, not yours, not the necessarily correct perception of events, but my perception. Okay, that's very key to all of this, because I'm describing my experience. It's all I'm doing, describing my experience and owning it. And then the third thing is, what are my feelings? How I feel? Well, you know, especially if I'm in touch with my body, I feel angry, I feel agitated, I'm excited, I'm happy, I'm mad, I'm worried. And then the fourth element is what I need from this situation. Okay. So my ability or inability to express those things really depends on my level of self-awareness, doesn't it? So as in all things, in all kinds of communication, it begins with just how mindful am I of what's really going on with me. And then making choices from that. Okay, is that the attitude I want in this situation? I recognize there's hostility here. Can I put that on hold and choose to do this, to have a positive attitude? So when we're working for mindfulness, we always have choices and we always have options. And so do you mind if I share your story, which you shared with me earlier?
I'm sitting here going, why didn't I breathe?
Yeah. So you gave, why don't you tell them what you did today? Do you mind?
No, I don't mind.
Go ahead.
I'll give another speech. This will be easier for me because I come off the cuff. I sing a lot. I've been singing since I was in 4th grade, so I have no problem getting in front of a group of people and singing. I can belt one out, you name it, I can sing. Today I had to give a speech for speech class, and I've already known that I freeze, or I get nauseous, or I hyperventilate when I give a speech. And this was my second speech. The first one went really well. This was my second speech. I had to prepare, I had to write an outline, had to have a thesis statement, had to have a body, had a conclusion. Yeah, I even had a quote. That was memorized before I gave a speech. I got through the first 5 words of that quote and I froze. And I froze and I froze and I froze. I froze probably a dozen times during this speech. And I got really nervous. My palms sweated. I did everything wrong. I started fiddling with my note cards. I started reading the note cards and not looking at the people. I can remember there's this point where I got through maybe the second note card and I looked up and someone was like, okay, you're over time. You know? So it was really a disaster. When I got out of the speech, I fled the scene close to tears. I felt like crying all the way till I got to the library. I got in the elevator and then it hit me like a ton of bricks, 10 times worse than it was in front of all those people. And I started hyperventilating really bad and I started shaking really bad. And I mean, my whole body was just taken over by these feelings. And as soon as I walked, I was still reacting to it when I walked in here and I was like, I just can't wait till we go, I want to go, and let it all go because I could feel so much anxiety inside of me. And he says, did you remember to breathe? And I'm like, oh, if I'd only breathe, if I'd only took that moment to be there, to be really there, it would have still been bad. It would have still gone that way. But maybe I wouldn't have had that complete bodily reaction to it. I mean, I felt like I just really overreacted and then I had no control over. So yeah, I think really being there and not being just a bundle of fear of giving a speech. Just being there, being with the other students, like I'm here with you now. Still as can be, totally loud and proud, but unprepared, unplanned, it was just no problem.
Well, when I asked you to share that, I had no idea it was quite that overwhelming for you, but thank you, yeah.
I fight and I can see
yeah.
where if you it's not bad to have a plan, but a plan of attack on yourself and knowing where you are and being yourself, aware of yourself. You know, I had not even thought about that at all. I wish I totally used what I learned in this class before I gave that speech.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, if one of the things that I do, and we talked about this in the mindfulness lab just this week, is when we go when we move transition from one event to the next, as I enter into that event, before the event, just taking a moment to take a breath, to become mindful, to take an inventory. What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What's going on in my body? What is my attitude at this time? Having that knowledge entering in can make all the difference in the world. It may not take away those feelings, but I'm in a position to respond rather than simply react, which is kind of builds on itself. So, and of course, sometimes being mindful is uncomfortable because what's there is uncomfortable. But at least I'm in a position to choose. I'm in a position to choose. Thank you for sharing that. So whole messages, but you know, easier said than done. Easier said than done, right? Try this on your spouse. Now, what would happen here? Hypothetical. What if you and your spouse, your girlfriend, boyfriend, best friend, roommate, okay? Now, you and your roommate are communication experts, but it would be fun to watch you guys communicate. But what if we said, okay, this time around, we're going to try this whole messages. I know it's really dumb, but listen, I'll do this and you'll do that, okay? And then what we'll do is we'll keep going back and forth until each other understands where the other is coming from. Wouldn't that be something? To where you really felt your partner understood where you were coming from. And wouldn't it be satisfying to know that you really understood where your partner was coming from? And what happens, which really is remarkable when it comes to conflict management and those kinds of things, once we understand each other's perceptions, each other's insides, we more quickly reach towards agreement. A number of years ago, I had the opportunity to serve as a mediator for the Dispute Resolution Center in Grand Rapids. And there was a number of faculty here at Ferris who had the opportunity to train in that. In fact, I have done mediation with my secretary, Ella. And we used to do mediation right here on campus, okay? So it was open to everybody. It could be faculty, students, whatever. But in mediation, what we do is primarily get both parties to get everything out there they possibly can so that the other party has an opportunity to see where they move from. And it's amazing. 9 times out of 10, the people will come to an agreement. And our job is not to make it happen, it's just to facilitate the communication. In a sense, we're trying to get whole messages. We're trying to get their thoughts out, their feelings, their perceptions, and in a way that isn't heated, in a way that isn't, you know, combative. And it's amazing how we will naturally find solution. So it isn't like you have to make it happen. In a very real sense, we're letting it happen, you know. So I encourage you to do that. So if you were my students, or if we had a lot of other time together, I would say let's do something when in class. But can you think of a relationship that where you'd like to try this? I guess your boss would be tough, but not me though. I've got it. I work with faculty and a really great department head. Okay, how about it? How about when you're working with clients? You and I? Oh, okay.
Clarify.
Okay, yes, well, I will clarify. So do you encourage your clients to use whole messages with each other?
Yes,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, it triggered a thought. I remember many years ago, my wife and I went through couples therapy. And it was very helpful, but nothing made my relationship better than meditation. That changed things in ways that therapy only started moving me in that direction. No offense. The therapy was central to saving the marriage. But one of the hardest things to do is when you're really defensive, some of you are going to identify with this, when you're really defensive and you're really pissed off and you think the other person is the problem, you know, and therefore the solution, you know, then when they're tearing their whole message, all you want to do is do what? You don't really want to listen. And it's so hard to sit in your hands and just listen, especially when you know you're going to have to paraphrase it back, okay? You know? And it's an extremely difficult thing to do. But I wasn't mindful in those situations, not really. I was just full of rage and anger and fear, and some of it I knew and some of it I didn't, but I didn't have that mindfulness. I was consumed by my feelings. And what mindfulness does, it changes our relationship to our feelings so that we have those feelings, but we're not consumed by them. It's the difference between I'm really angry and I notice this anger rising up in me. I am so afraid. I notice the fear that I have. I still have fear, but my relationship to that fear is a little bit different. Did you hear about that study that they just reported at NPR yesterday? Yeah, it was a study that they were looking at pain. And the idea is that they noticed when people meditated, they had them meditating on body parts. Let's say they had a bad foot. They had to meditate on the foot. Okay, the same kind of mindfulness meditation that we did. And they found that what that does, it causes the alpha waves, the low brain waves to pick up. And they have a very, very calming effect. And what the research shows, and we've known this before, people that completed the 8-week MBSR course, they found that it significantly diminished the pain because it kind of like runs interference. It gets in the way of the pain receptors. Okay? Well, not only does it work on physical pain, in a very real sense it works on emotional pain. Because emotional pain is as physiological as physical pain is. So we're not only changing our perspective, but we're changing our chemistry. We're bringing the parasympathetic nervous system in place of the activating system. So just like taking the couple of breaths. I would not use the word control. I would say that you're being okay with it. Remember what Shauna Shapiro said? She says, acceptance is just, this is the way it is. You know? That's just the way it is. And yeah, so.
But you're not letting it overwhelm you, or
you're letting it be what it is.
you're saying.
But she always talks about how when you recognize what it is, what kind of attitude do you bring to what you recognize? As I experience this fear, do I have an attitude of kindness? As I experience this anger, do I have an attitude of gentleness? And see, that's that idea. I notice my anger. I'm just angry. If I'm just the feeling, then how do I bring that? I notice I'm angry, I choose to bring kindness to it. See, it's that noticing, it's that mindfulness that gives us the opportunity to bring those attitudes to it. Just the noticing gives us that pause, that moment, that opportunity to bring something else to that. And it's interesting, worldwide, you know, there's one of the huge traditions in meditation is what's called metta-meditation, and loving kindness meditation. And it's deep meditation where you bring loving kindness to hurt, and it's the same idea as in a meditative state or in a mindful state, embracing it with kindness. So I can embrace that suffering with kindness, yours or mine. But I have to have that mindfulness, that container in which to do it. A couple days, go ahead.
I want to ask something. Several years ago, I was in a really bad car accident, and for 4 to 5 years, they tried everything from physical therapy to everything imaginable. They then wanted me to do biofeedback, which is training your mind to deal with the pain. Is that same idea? Mm-hmm. I was angry they wanted me to do that, okay? Mm-hmm. I'm like, I am in real pain. Why do you want me to learn how to deal with the pain?
May I say something? Because it's the same idea. What we're doing is we're developing a stability of the mind. Yeah. Okay? And the mind calms, it settles. Yeah. Okay? And those alpha waves kick in. The sympathetic nervous system is in place. So it achieves the same results.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I wasn't mentally ready to handle, I think, accepting the pain. So that's just interesting thinking about that's what they were trying to get me to relax and be able to deal with it.
Well, what's interesting about being mindful is it isn't like I say, oh, I want to accept this, although I might have the desire or intention to do that, but you can't make kindness, you can't make gentleness, you can't make acceptance. If I am willing to be present with my experience, out of that willingness, out of being with my experience, I naturally develop acceptance. I naturally develop compassion. Because what happens is I spend time with myself, I experience my suffering, I experience my joy, and it's in being with myself that those qualities develop.
I think it would have helped me if I was at that point.
Yeah.
To do that.
But yeah, you got to be ready. Yeah. Yeah. A couple days ago, I was all day long I was like had a low-grade anger going, you know, and it's just like I was just all day long, and so my natural inclination was to react. But I was mindful most of the time, and when I found myself being inclined to get pissed at that person, I went, whoa. And I said, wait a minute, and then I chose to do this. But it was with me all day long. And after a while, I started judging myself, of course. You know, oh, George, man. And then it's like, oh, man, so much for this mindfulness stuff, you know. now I'm really going to town, you know, go, whoa. But I was mostly aware of it, and it still affected me. But I wasn't acting out of that. And thankfully, the next day it let up a little bit. We can't always choose what our experience is, you know. But if we can be with it, then we have a lot more choice. And it's really about choices. So we have just a few minutes left, but I'm curious. Are any of you? If you could think of any place where you might use this, either professionally, personally?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. The thing is, and what I think is the real skill is learning how to, when you're angry or when you want to react, how to stop yourself. And so that's the thing that's going to be difficult. Because when you're in that situation, it's like, okay, I need to take a breath. I need to step back.
The one thing I would suggest, and we haven't really talked about it a lot in here, is to develop an awareness of just how judging you are of yourself, how harsh you are in your judgments, in your self-criticism, because that really does not serve us well. It really contributes to mindlessness rather than mindfulness. In part because that experience of judging ourselves and shaming ourselves is really quite painful. And none of us really want to go there. So when you have those mindful moments and you're really aware of that judgment, take note of that. Just say, wow, I'm being really judging. Wow, I'm being really judging. Oh, I'm judging myself for being judging. Take note of that. Each and every time we call ourselves on that, it loses some of its power on us. And I'm absolutely convinced, not only from mindfulness, but my more than 32 years in 12-step recovery, that self-criticism, that self-judgment, that self-loathing is really our biggest enemy. You know, that's what really holds us back. That constrains us. We have this kind of crazy idea that if I'm really hold myself accountable, that somehow I'm going to be better. Well, there's a big difference between being accountable and being judgmental, being full of shoulds. So I encourage you, whenever you find yourself doing it, just take note of it. Well, there I go again. Wow, that really hurts when I do that. Just take note of it.
What about judging others, though? I mean, that's where a lot of the anger, for me at least, comes from, is judging others. They're not doing what they need to do. So does that work the same way?
I don't know. What do you think? Does that work the same way? What do we mean by judging? Do we mean holding people accountable to a certain standard?
Yeah, part of it.
Okay. So you said you were going to do this and you didn't follow through, and our agreement was you would. So what are we going to do about it?
I've learned to try to be very understanding, because I would like it for myself as well.
Ah, okay.
Especially when I'm dealing with students. Students are a lot younger than me. When I was their age, how did I think? How did I act? How responsible was I? So I try to be that forgiving as I would want to be when I was that age.
Let me try to answer the question this way. We know in the research on compassion that in developing empathy for others, compassion for others, begins first of all with developing compassion for myself. And so we know from the research that as I became aware of my own suffering, and because of my mindfulness, I tend to move compassionately towards my suffering okay, that when I experience other people and their suffering, then I'm inclined to move towards their suffering in the same way I am towards mine. And this is something we know from the compassion research. So if I tend to be judgmental towards myself, then I will be judgmental towards others, emotionally, this and that. I may know in a particular social situation it's not appropriate for me to behave that way, and so that will significantly influence my behavior. But at my deepest level, I'm just as judgmental about them or not as I am about myself. I can only be as compassionate towards others as I am towards myself. You know, so that's kind of the idea. So each of us has to make that decision about what is judging. But judging always has an edge to it, doesn't it? Mm-hmm. Yeah. We know what it's like to be judged or judged. Yeah. So just pay attention to your own self-critic. You had a comment?
Oh, no. Sure, why not? I find this useful at 5 o'clock when I pick up my 5-year-old son from daycare, whether what kind of a day I've had and how I'm feeling. I think about that just before I go in to pick him up, because his reaction to me, and then if we end up getting snippy with each other later, it's good I lay it out on the table like, look bud, I'm a little grumpy today, so, you know, just work with me here, or something like that.
Beautiful.
And it's just, we have a fairly, and sometimes he'll say the same thing, I'm kind of grumpy too, or something like that, you know.
That's beautiful. That's the short version of a whole message. That's beautiful. You're basically just saying, hey, this is what's going on with me, and now he knows what's going on with you, and he can see how that influences your behavior. That's a beautiful thing. Where we're headed for next week with the listening thing is next week we're going to take the notion of whole messages and we're going to include them as part of the listening process. And we're going to talk about what's called dialogic listening. And dialogic listening is even different than active listening, something you're all familiar with. And the idea behind dialogic listening, there is no sender, there is no receiver, there's no speaker, there's no listener. You have both have that same responsibility. And in a very real sense, you're doing both at the same time. And it all starts with our own awareness of our own sensations, our own thoughts and feelings. And so, in a sense, it's very much like listening meditatively. So that's what we'll be talking about next week.